Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Jacqueline Mishimaya, and I'm the Associate Vice Provost for Diversity and Inclusion, and I will serve as your moderator this evening. Tonight's event is the fourth and last installment of the dialogue series, Right for Change, Conversations on Race in America. This series has been made possible because of the partnership with the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, the Ohio State Alumni Association, and the Ohio State Alumni Magazine. And speaking of that magazine, I strongly encourage each of you to read or reread the Alumni Magazine's Autumn 2020 special issue that spearheaded this critical series. A link to this special issue by Mary Alice Casey and her dedicated team can be found in the chat box at this time. This special issue also highlights today's panelists and has our current president, Dr. Christina Johnson, on its cover. Please read it. It is absolutely amazing. Today's topic is entitled An Anti-Racist Future, the Fierce Urgency of Now. After hearing from our distinguished guests today, we hope to leave you with an increased interest in two main points today. One, understanding how racism infects every dimension of our society. And two, the role of the collective Buckeye community in achieving an anti-racist future. And if you follow Dr. Ibram Kendi's work on anti-racism, he's very clear on where he stands on all of this. He asserts that either you're a racist or you're anti-racist. You're either part of the problem or you're part of the solution. He unapologetically states that there is no room for neutrality or ambiguity. And I agree. It is absolutely imperative that we all take an anti-racist stand with a fierce urgency now. And while we're talking about racism, let's acknowledge the plight of the indigenous in this country through a land acknowledgement statement. The Ohio State Alumni Association and the Office of Diversity and Inclusion would like to acknowledge the original occupants of the land that the university sits on. The university occupies the ancestral and contemporary lands of the Shawnee, Potawatomi, Delaware, Miami, Peoria, Seneca, Wyandot, Ojibwe, and Cherokee peoples. We acknowledge the painful history of genocide and forced removal from this territory, and we honor and respect the many diverse indigenous peoples still connected to this land on which we gather. Please allow that to sit with you for a moment. Thank you. Now let's move on to why we're all here today. We're here to have a candid conversation on an anti-racist future. And let's meet today's committed and talented scholar activists. So first, we have Nikki Trotman-Bazinski. She's a senior advisor at the Justice Collaborative. The JC is a team of legal experts, researchers, media strategists, and journalists who work through the complexity and the confusion around how to end dehumanization and the extreme marginalization of people in this country. Their work is cut out for them and they're needed in this society. Nikki is also a former public defender, a teacher, and a graduate of the Moritz College of Law, where she now serves as an adjunct professor. Welcome, Nikki. We also have Dr. Trayvon Logan. He's an internationally recognized scholar in economic demography, economic history, and applied microeconomics. I think he knows something about economics. His current research focuses on historical health problems, racial discrimination, political economy, and mortality, morbidity, and racial disparities in health. His award-winning research has been featured in a number of major media outlets, and he's also a professor of economics and an associate dean in the College of Arts and Sciences here at Ohio State. Welcome, Dr. Logan. And then last, we have Dr. Hassan Kwame Jeffries. He's an associate professor of history at Ohio State, where he has been teaching courses on the civil rights and Black Power movements for the last 18 years. He is a subject area expert on these movements and a highly sought out speaker on the topics I just mentioned. But not only is he known for telling like it is in his books and other outlets, because he does indeed do that, but he's also known for his teaching excellence. He is the recipient of a number of teaching awards, including the university's highly coveted Alumni Award for Distinguished Teaching. Please welcome all of our panelists here today. So now we have about 55 minutes left to continue with today's program. So let me get right to it with our panelists. I want to start with a general question based on your subject areas of expertise. And here it is. So in about 1 or 2 minutes, please answer this question. I'll start with Nikki with her response. So how can the law, economics, and learning our history help us to advance towards an anti-racist future? Nikki, I'll start with you.
Thank you, Jacqueline. So my initial reaction to this question is to note that people often look at the law as inherently good, as a positive. So we understand this when people say something is illegal, they understand it to be bad. And if something's legal, it's positive, right? And generally believe that the law is a force for good. And I want to push back on that. The law is just a tool. And so like a hammer, it can be used to build things and improve them, but it can also be used to break things down and harm them. And so if we want to use the law to advance towards an anti-racist future, we need to understand the laws that we're relying on. We need to understand how they've been used in the past. We need to understand the context. And we have to know what that anti-racist future looks like and how the law might be used to actually effectuate it. So it's a big question, and I don't have any specific answers, but to get to any kind of answer, I think we would have to do a lot of deep diving into whatever that vision of an anti-racist future would look like and how the law is currently helping get us there or actually hindering us from getting there.
Thank you, Nikki. And I love the use of the word tool. That's an excellent way to describe that. Dr. Jeffries, what about you? What about learning our history?
Well, I think history is critical. Too often we frame history or our concern about the past as it connects to the present as being a concern about repeating it. But I think that's actually that emphasis is off. I'm less concerned about repeating it than I am about continuing it, and continuing the things that we have done in the past that have created inequality that we've never stopped doing. And so I think part of our challenge of creating an anti-racist future is disrupting these continuities. But how can you do that? How can you do that effectively? Well, you can't disrupt the patterns and these continuities if you're unable to recognize what they are in the first place. And so teaching about the past and understanding the past isn't just so that we can learn about the past. I think, yeah, of course, but it's to help us understand the present and to prepare young people, to prepare students to tackle the challenges of tomorrow. So building an anti-racist future is predicated on us understanding the ways in which racism informs and shapes the world in which we live today, based upon the ways in which it has informed and shaped the world that we have lived in. So teaching the past accurately and effectively will get us to the place where we can actually make sense of how we got here, and then prepare our students, give them the tools, as Nikki just pointed out, to shape the imagined world that we do not live in yet.
Thank you so much. So that whole saying about, oh, it's in the past, it doesn't matter, obviously is unfounded. Thank you for your point. And Dr. Logan, what about economics and an anti-racist future?
I think it's important when we consider the economy as itself an institution that enacts and reifies many of our societal norms about race. It's very important to understand that economic policy is fundamentally social policy. And so the narratives that we have about race are embedded in our social policies, things that might not seem to have direct racial implications, you will discover are many times enacted, designed, and enforced along racial lines. So let me give you one example of what actually an anti-racist policy is. the very beginning of the establishment of a minimum wage in the United States, certain occupations were excluded. And these occupations were disproportionately held by Black people, disproportionately held by Hispanic people, people who worked in the agricultural settings, people who worked as laundresses, for example, were completely excluded under this minimum wage legislation. Finally, in the 1960s, when the number of occupations that were underneath this policy was expanded, it literally closed the racial income gap by about 30%. Recent research by Laura Derenoncourt has shown. And so that ends up becoming a policy that leads us to greater equality, but there's never any mention of race in the policy itself, but its execution was, of course, along racial lines. So I think it's really important to understand in the economy that this can reify our racial hierarchy if we don't really truly investigate the causes and the reasoning behind the types of economic policies that we pursue.
Thank you very much. And another example why we need all professionals and all the disciplines, including economics, to be part of this anti-racist future. Thank you, Dr. Logan. And then Nikki, you mentioned a few minutes ago about the law. The law can be used to our advantage and to the disadvantage of some groups of people as a tool. So what are some of the ways then that we can disrupt and dismantle systemic racism in terms of the law? How can that be undone?
Yeah, so I think traditionally lawyers have viewed that as something that we do through the courts, right? That we file the amazing brief or try the important case, and that we get social change that way. And we've definitely taken steps towards social change that way. But for me, I think I want the law to be a tool in the hands of the people, grassroots organizers who are pushing for these really transformative changes in our society. So to the extent that lawyers can work in partnership with communities and help them build power and help them become more effective and give them the tools that they need, that's where I see our position in society and our skill set being used most effectively to work toward that anti-racist future.
Thank you, working together. Thank you so much for that. And then Dr. Hassan, we know a lot about student movements. We know that students have been integral factors and agitators and motivators and getting things done when it comes to converting institutions. So why was the Brickell Hall takeover in 1968 such a critical shift for the university? And how did this sacrifice of the OSU 34 really start to impact the underserved and marginalized here at Ohio State? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think with any student protest, and the takeover clearly is an example of that. We have to, what is plainly visible to some in terms of racial inequality and racism and racial discrimination is often unseen by others or ignored by others. And so that kind of direct action forces people to see and to acknowledge what they either choose purposefully to ignore or just haven't been paying attention to. And so the act in and of itself doesn't necessarily create change per se, but that kind of pressure then forces those inside, those with, with their hands on the levers of power, to have to react, to have to then, demands are being made, increasing Black faculty and starting a Black Studies program and the like. Demands then have to be responded to. And so almost to pair what Ms. Brzezinski had pointed out, you have to have sort of pressure from both inside and pressure from outside. And lawyers, to a certain extent, the law can be considered as sort of an inside mechanism, but that direct action, that pressure from the outside, then forces those who have their hands on the levers of power to have to act, to do what they had otherwise ignored or chosen to do the opposite of. So that becomes like one of these critical moments in the history of trying to move Ohio State in a better direction, because it forces the university to do what it had refused to do before, to actually stop practicing some of those enacting some of those discriminatory policies. And more than that, not just stop doing the negative, but to start doing the positive.
Thank you. I just want to follow up quickly with your points, though, about the students being behind the whole um, change in or adding the new department on African American Studies, and about the ODI, Office of Diversity and Inclusion, and the Black Cultural Center. Why do you think students are the forerunners and really making those in charge put their hands on the levers, so to speak, and change some things? Why the students?
Well, look, it's always students, right? I mean, you look at the history of higher education and the progressive changes that have come, particularly around race, but also around gender. It's students, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's students who have been pushing the envelope. Institutions, Ohio State is no different, go Buckeyes, but let's just be clear, institutions of higher education are inherently conservative, right? And they are slow to move, right? And we see that the moments where they do take major steps forward, great leaps forward, it has been because students have led the charge. It may come a little bit later than the actual action, but it's been students, students, students. And so it's always important, I think, to listen and to see what it is that students are demanding, right? Because they're the ones who have this vision of not just what the future ought to be, but what the present ought to be, right, for themselves. And it's also students in connection with the community. Right? Often we think about sort of students in isolation, but they're connected to local communities and they're connected to their home communities. And so the student activism, student protests, student demonstrations, students' demands are often a reflection of the broader community sentiment, broader community demand. So it's the students who embody it, the students who have the energy, the students who have the drive and determination, the time, and they're in the place. But it is very much an extension of a broader community sentiment, Black community sentiment in this instance, to make Ohio State live up to its land grant promise, to live up to being a people's university.
Thank you so much. And you made an excellent point about community. So I'm going to shift now to Dr. Logan about the community. So your research shows that segregation is a predictor of many aspects of a Black or Brown person's life in their given communities. And so concurrently shows as an indicator of a person's attitudes and beliefs of a white person that been in the same place as well. So how do you explain these two concepts? How are they connected?
So the first answer to your question is how do we measure segregation, right? Because to say segregation, you have to first think about what we're talking about. So in a project that I started several years ago, we took the manuscript census files and we measured segregation house by house by house for the entire United States. And it did two things that are very important. The first is it uncovered patterns of segregation, residential segregation in rural areas. So traditional measures of segregation only apply to cities. And we know the work of Dr. Jeffries, for example, looking at counties in Alabama, for example, show us that rural areas have problems with segregation and have impacts with segregation. So what we found from that research, when you have a national picture of segregation, and now we're not just telling a traditional story about African Americans migrating to cities and whites moving out of central cities into suburban communities, we found that segregation is a process that has national dynamics. And it works in rural areas and it works in urban areas. And that's a really interesting finding because it tells us that these racial dynamics are not mediated by issues pertaining to cities and influxes, say, of new African Americans. The second, we found that segregation is about power dynamics in the ability to include some and the ability to exclude others from these processes. Even things like home ownership initiatives by the federal government are predicated on segregation patterns that are baked into the value of homes, which themselves are a function of the racial composition of communities. And the third piece is that segregation is highly persistent. So we found that measuring segregation in 1880 and segregation in 1940 was highly predictive. So what happens is the nation becomes more segregated, but the areas that were more segregated in the past simply become the most segregated again in the future as the nation experiences this. So there's something going on that is baked into the way that we have residential living patterns, which we have found affects racial violence, predicts health outcomes for African Americans and for whites. And another thing that we found is that contrary to a popular narrative that segregation is only bad for African Americans, we have some evidence that segregation is also bad for whites as well. So this troubles the story when we're able to paint a national picture about where people are living, what that means about how resources are distributed and allocated in communities, and also what it fundamentally tells us about the political structure, which is necessary to keep segregation as a pattern and to enhance its effects.
Thank you so much for connecting the dots. I think that oftentimes we see them as being very separate issues: housing, economics, the overall well-being of a group of people. Thank you for that connection. You mentioned two really important words that goes back to what Nikki is doing. You mentioned power dynamics and racial dynamics in terms of communities. So Nikki, my question, so I'm gonna dovetail off of Dr. Logan's comment, is about what's going on, the social unrest. We know the many killings caught on camera in recent days: Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd. What has the protests around these killings meant for your work as someone who is a legal activist and a legal scholar?
Dr. Jeffrey's point about, there came a point where the people on the inside just couldn't look away any longer is what that popped into my head when you talked about the protests this summer. I think we reached a point where nationally and even across the world, this epidemic of police brutality and violence, the way that it is functioning in society as an oppressive force, there wasn't an opportunity anymore to look away. People couldn't resist it. They couldn't remain silent. The demand for change just grew so big that it was impossible. I have been working toward and interested in change within the criminal legal system for quite a few years. And I think back to, even just a few years ago, the idea of like body cameras was a really bold ask, right? Everyone was debating that. And we're at the point where defunding police entirely is the ask on the table. And I think it's, the obvious answer is the people pushing for that change, uniting together and really lifting up all of these issues and connecting them to not just the police brutality, but also what have we lost because we've invested so much in policing? What have we not provided to our communities in the form of healthcare, in schooling, in economic justice? Because we've been so emphasized so much the idea that punishment is the way that will improve things. And that conversation too has been really helpful in shifting policy. And so I'm interested in how are we shifting policies that improve the lives of people today? And you can look across the country and see not just that police budgets are being curtailed and lessened, but that those city councils, those local officials are putting that money into other things so that we're not just dismantling a system or trying to, we're actually looking to how can we then build up things that are actually going to really produce public safety, really stabilize communities. And that's really exciting to see so much momentum and to see so much opportunity there.
So Nikki, as a follow-up then, do you see these changes with the whole ask of defunding law enforcement and curtailing their power and authority and the body cameras? Do you see that flowing from the Department of Justice at that level of change?
I think we've seen the most exciting changes, the most fundamental changes at the local level. This Department of Justice, nothing is coming to mind that indicates to me that is a place where we're gaining traction right now. I'm looking and thinking about Seattle City Council, Minneapolis City Council, Austin City Council, the excitement people have about the Cahoots program in Eugene, Oregon, and what would it look like if when someone was having a mental health crisis in our community, not asking the federal government, for support, though there are really great bills that are being passed to support local communities in these efforts, but to look to civilian first responders who are equipped to address those crises and really respond appropriately. That I see a lot more momentum there, and I see people really pushing their local elected officials in those ways and actually gaining successes, gaining policy shifts.
Thank you so much, because it is time for a change, Nikki, and you've outlined a number of reasons why it's right for change now, today, at this very moment, with a fierce urgency. Thank you so much. And on that same line, Dr. Hassan Jeffries, some of our alum are skeptical about Ohio State. You mentioned Ohio 34 and the work they've done back then, the work that students are doing today. Some say we've been having these same conversations on race and equity for decades at Ohio State. We've been protesting and marching for increased diversity and representation at all levels of the university for ages. So with that in mind, are the student movements today no different than those that came before? And if not, why might it be different this time? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, they're certainly connected. And when folks say, hey, Black folk been protesting, since 1619, yeah, it's true, right? I mean, as Trayvon pointed out, racism is not just a regional phenomenon. It's just not, something that's fixed in time. Inequality is the American way. And Ohio State is not immune from that. So yeah, students have been fighting and the community's been fighting to get equality at Ohio State since Ohio State started. And until you get to the point where you have sort of full equality, not just here at Ohio State, but sort of nationally, you're still gonna have students protesting. I think that's what it means to struggle, right? And I think it's important. Yes, yes, yeah, you're right. You're not being deceived. Like, people have been fighting, right, since 1870. But there has been change. Like, that's the important thing. It's been, I mean, the reason why students are still taking to the streets, why you have Black Lives Matter protests, right, like on campus, is because students are frustrated with the slow pace of progress. It's like, yeah, we want more, we want to see more, we want to connect, the problems that we're seeing with the Columbus Division of Police and the relationship that has with the campus police here. Let's interrogate that. So I think, it's connected. Yes, but yes, there's still protests, and there will be protests going on in the future. But that doesn't mean that there hasn't been progress, that there hasn't been change, right? Black students could stay on campus. There you go, progress, right? I mean, so, but we shouldn't say, hey, enough. The problem is that enough progress hasn't been made. And we're just coming out of a moment where we saw a decline in Black enrollment for almost a decade, right? I mean, so these types of questions are still on the table, still need to be addressed. And history tells us that as long as the problems persist, you will still have students, and you will still have young people, and you will still have alumni who are determined to do the things to make Ohio State a better place.
Absolutely. And you said you've been here for 18 years teaching. I've been here for 22 years. There is some progress, but yet there's still work to be done. Absolutely. Thank you for your point. And Dr. Logan, let's talk about systemic racism. You're all suggesting and asserting definitively that this is a system problem across the country. Ohio State, as Dr. Hassan Jeffries just said, is not immune to being part of this racist ideology, sometimes manifesting itself throughout the university. So let's talk about where people live in terms of locality. So is it systemic racism, personal choice, or both factors that inform a person's decision to live in a community with other people of the same race, and to what degree? So is it systemic? Is it personal? Is it both? Why do people like to be around people like themselves? Let's start with that question first.
Well, I think what we have to think about is how we have choices and how some people don't have choices, and how our choices are constrained by these long historical processes. So let me show you a picture to sort of highlight what this actually looks like if you're thinking about cities. So this is an example of New York City. And New York City is color coded according to some maps that were drawn in the 1930s by the Homeowners Loan Corporation. These HOLC maps designated areas of a city as high risk or low risk and graded them in 4 areas, A, B, C, and D. A areas are the green areas, are the best parts of the city where you will be able to obtain a loan for a very low interest rate. And the red areas are the most dangerous parts to lend in a city. Those areas and the drawing of those maps was based upon segregation patterns that existed before the maps were actually drawn. And this is New York. And so what are all these little dots? All of these little dots are all the locations in green books, which are places that African Americans had identified that they could receive non-discriminatory services. And so if you look at this relationship between these, you'll see that even in cities like Atlanta, it's the same relationship. All of the places that served African Americans in a non-discriminatory way were located in these largely African American communities. And if I went to Chicago, I'd see the same pattern of where people lived forming where they actually received non-discriminatory services. And that includes Columbus, Ohio. And if you looked at the residential patterns of Columbus, Ohio, and the metro area of Columbus today, this pattern still fits. Right? The houses in Bexley, Ohio are much more expensive than the houses in Columbus. And this city has a racial pattern of living that is predicated on these maps that were drawn in the 1930s. So when we talk about individual choice and we talk about these other sorts of issues, we forget that the choice that you face in the housing market today is in fact a long run function of decisions that were made long ago, predicated on ideas about racial segregation, predicated on ideas about racial inferiority, and predicated on race. And it becomes embedded in property values themselves that propagate and actually then fund public school systems, et cetera. So all of these are interrelated and intergenerational factors that happen over time.
So Dr. Logan, I'm glad you brought those maps up. Thank you for doing that. So you're seeing and showing consistency across the country in this pattern. Who do we need to bring to the table to address this? Who are the other key players we need to be talking to about an anti-racist future?
I think it's very important to recognize that many of these policies, whether you're talking about gaps in income, gaps in wealth, gaps in employment opportunities, in fact stem from federal policies. And we must have federal action. It really is not something, given this scale and scope, that can be solved at the local level because it wasn't instituted at the local level. Columbus cannot solve a national problem of segregation in homeownership, of lack of access to wealth, and the lack of, say, reparations for the descendants of slavery. That is not a solution that Columbus can reach. It doesn't have the fiscal capacity to do it. It could only be done by the federal government. And these policies were instituted by the federal government. So they are actually the responsible party. So it's very important to understand that this really is at the top, and a broad national policy is needed to address these issues.
Absolutely. Thank you. You're just reaffirming the importance of how we need to change policies, because and practices and procedures and people in positions, because all of that is entangled to create the system and the mess that we continue to have to deal with to this day. So thank you for that connection there. And in that same vein, Nikki, we're talking about an infrastructure, systemic racism. People are becoming disenchanted, demoralized, and doubtful of equity and justice in this country. In fact, some racialized communities have lost faith in the legal system. And Nikki, you're part of this legal system and you're doing something different contrary to some of the folks who people are upset with. So what are some of the examples of good tools and resources that we can find to effectively navigate this opaque legal system? You mentioned tools earlier. What can we use to our disposal to help us have an anti-racist future?
Yeah, so I think one of the first things I would say, just in expanding the understanding of the legal system, is a helpful starting point for communities that want to affect change. Like, you have to know what the problems are in order to start working towards solutions. One of the ways that that has become apparent and better understood is through court watching. It's a really helpful tool to understand how courts are operating on a day-to-day basis, to get more insight into procedures, but also into how justice is being effectuated. In Ferguson, the Arch City Defenders had a court watching program that really revealed a lot. So all of the revelations about how the courts were essentially using criminal prosecutions to fund and create revenue for the city. How that was happening was part of a larger court watching project. And so I think that's a really great tool that communities can use to learn more about their court systems. The National Lawyers Guild, the ACLU, I'm sure there are a lot of organizations put on Know Your Rights trainings to know what rights you have, how to assert them, and what it might look like to weigh the risk of asserting them in the moment, or being aware of what may happen during an arrest or during a protest, and what you can expect in later court proceedings. I also, as far as resources, I think we've got some amazing community organizations throughout Ohio that have done a great deal of work to expand awareness and understanding of the criminal legal systems here, both how they function and the ways that they need to be improved. So I'm thinking about the Cuyahoga County Jail Coalition and the work that they've done up in Cleveland, the Central Ohio Bail Fund here, and really increasing the understanding of how cash bail operates, how it's unfair, but also just how you can post bail and what that looks like has really expanded our understanding of that system. So those are the things that are coming to mind as far as better understanding the system to know how to change it.
Thank you. And Nikki, do you think that people, just common folks like us, those who are not legal scholars, do you think we're starting to get more interested in learning these nuances given the current climate of the country?
I think so. I think, again, as Dr. Jeffrey said, I think the demand for change has grown so loud, and it's just the number of instances that we've seen, unfortunately, in how the system is not operating. And we've seen the videos of police brutality. We've seen the worst, but I don't think we can ignore, unfortunately, just some of the mundane, everyday injustices that happen routinely. Those also deserve attention. And I think those two are things that people are working toward expanding the public understanding of. So I had mentioned cash bail earlier, this idea that because you don't have money, your freedom would be taken from you. You haven't been convicted of a crime, but you're going to sit in a jail cell just because you don't have money. A person who had money would get out. That idea just is, it just makes no sense to me, but we've sort of, for such a long time, taken it for granted as a society that just, yeah, if you can't post bail, you stay in jail. And I think, again, it's been the work of community organizations and activists and a lot of people in the legal community to really push back and say, this is a system that fundamentally harms people. People lose their jobs, they lose their houses, they might lose their children just because they can't post a few $100s in bail. What is this system and how can we change it?
It is fundamentally flawed, Nikki. But could you just speak for just 1 minute about the Justice Collaborative in terms of how you all are going about your work in this context?
So the Justice Collaborative, we've worked with community organizations, we've worked with lawmakers, so we're interested in policies that address those issues. So,
Go ahead.
Well, no, Dr. Jeffries, did you have something you wanted to add?
Oh, I was only going to add to the list of consequences, as you were pointing out, with folk who can't get out of jail because they can't afford a few $100s. Texas, reported out several hundred people have died in Texas jails as a result of coronavirus, 80% of whom had not been convicted of a crime. They're sitting there waiting on trial, essentially couldn't get out. 80% wind up with a capital sentence because they couldn't afford to get out of jail. I mean, so the consequences of this include lethality. I mean, it literally becomes life or death to a certain extent.
That is incredible.
Nikki, you wanted to respond to him and say something?
No, that's an incredibly important point. And it's happened here. Even before COVID, in the Cuyahoga County Jail, there were people who had died pre-trial, who had not yet been convicted of a crime. So that's across the country. But yes, certainly since COVID, it has been a death sentence. So thank you so much, Dr. Jeffries, for highlighting that.
Yeah, and I read about those stats as well, and that's the real crime. So thank you for bringing that point up. And so in terms of trying to look ahead, trying to give some folks some hope and optimism for the future, so what do you see as the role of future generations of faculty in nurturing, developing students and supporting them in this movement, whatever the movement is at the period of time we're talking about? What is the role of faculty?
Was that to me? I'm sorry.
Yes, Dr. I'm
Oh,
sorry.
I'm sorry.
I apologize.
No, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I was waiting. I was like, ooh, what is the role? I was excited to hear the answer. Well, I think it's incumbent upon us as faculty to respond to the demands of students and young people. And what we have seen over not just this summer, but over the last several years has been an increasing demand for by students, to learn about sort of justice and fairness, and not just sort of what was it or how it didn't exist, but what can we do to bring it about. I teach a course on the civil rights movement, and from 2016, the fall of 2016, till present, that the number of students in that class has grown exponentially, from 25 to 40 to 60 to 70 to 120 this semester right now. And that's not because I'm doing anything different, right? Same class, same professor, same time. It's even more difficult, challenging now because we're online. But that number is going. Why? Because the students want to see something different, right? I mean, they're like, look, it's not just about what's in a book. It's like, how can I change the world? I mean, we got kids out here who are trying to figure out how to change the world. And we have to do our part in our respective fields to help prepare them to meet those challenges, right? To create the world that we have been unable to create. I think that is part of our challenge and our task. And the students demand it, and more importantly, they deserve it. They deserve our best when it comes to that. They're preparing them in our own way, right? Whatever our areas of specialty, but how do we connect that to the issues that are truly troubling them, to the issues that have plagued us for so long, and that we're leaving on their plate for them to address and deal with? Like, that is our responsibility, to see what we can do to help them address these problems going forward.
I agree. I would say, especially racially minoritized students who are leaders and activists on campus, they carry an undue burden of trying to tackle on all of these common problems that continue to be problematic on the university campus. But as a follow-up, though, Dr. Jeffries, so what about faculty? They're feeling, racial battle fatigue themselves. So what about faculty? Who's supposed to be there for them?
Yeah, well, I'm wondering that too. I'm looking around like, we could use some help out in this joint, right? On the front lines of this. Students are getting tired. We're getting tired too. Faculty of color have always, shouldered a fair bit of this burden. But you know what? It's a cost that comes with the job, as I see it, right? Like, it's if it wasn't for those students who risked their college educations, who risked their livelihoods back in '68, like, I wouldn't be here, right? Like, I wouldn't be here. And so so I owe it to the current generation of students to do what I can, right? To not only in the classroom, but also to be supportive of the work that they are doing and the efforts they are doing, whether that's a protest or trying to meet and talk with the president or whatever it is, or issues in the department. Like that, I owe that to this generation because of what that previous generations of students did to make it possible for them to be here and for me to be here. And so I think one of the things that we need to do that we should do as faculty is be willing to sort of ally with our students, so be supportive of our students who are willing to do this. Like, they're not only, like, these kids were out here facing the police. Like this isn't, these weren't Sunday marches, right? I mean, we saw them being tear gassed. We saw the violence emanating from police departments, right? I mean, these are militarized police here in Columbus and elsewhere. And these kids were out, if they can show the courage to face police who, are professing to have non-lethal weapons, yet people are being hurt and people are risking their lives, then hell, you should be able to talk, speak up in your department meeting. Right? What you worried about the department chair for? And they're facing police. Come on. Right? I mean, that's the least that we can do, is be allies with them, be supportive of them, be in conversation with them. Because in the end, it's them, they are the ones who are going to make this university what it really ought to be going forward.
Absolutely. Well said. Tell them like it is. I really appreciate that. And that brings me to a comment that my colleague always says, that none of us can afford to relinquish our adulthood based on our jobs. going to have to always be adults, despite our positions and our titles and maybe you're at the vulnerable levels of not being tenured yet or at the professor rank, but not to relinquish our adulthood. And I love the fact that you're mentioning about the importance of being an ally to one another, and especially for our students to do this great work. Thank you. Let me go on to Dr. Logan. I want to find something optimistic. You keep, spewing out this impressive data. It's in our face. It's very blatant and very telling. You've showed us several cities and several states about this racialized pattern of segregation. Have you found any city that is not doing this in this country, that is just totally different, any metropolitan city area that is doing something different that's contrary to your findings so far?
So I'm an economist, and so you're probably not going to like this answer, but I haven't found a city that is some salient example that goes against these forces. A big part of that reason is even if you have a city that is pushing for change, there are other things that happen at the state level, right, that we see, right? For example, controversies around gerrymandering. And we'll see this again because we have had a new census and we'll have congressional districting and redistricting in all states. And that process tends to favor whatever political party is currently in power in the state house. And so we're going to expect that again. That leads to some dilution of power and policy at the state level at a time in which we've had intensive federalization, essentially at the state level, where a lot of resources are allocated from the state to different communities. That's a deliberate strategy to try to starve some areas that are seeking to change some of these patterns by denying state funding for their initiatives. It really is something that that is happening and that we need to pay more careful attention to. There are some things that we can do at the national level, but I have not seen cities successfully be able to turn that corner without some significant headwinds, even in some of the cities this summer that we were talking about that have begun these conversations about reforming the police, for example, have had some problems actually following through on these procedures because they realize that there are some administrative and regulatory roadblocks that are put in place for them, for example, to fully reform their police systems. So there are lots of things that we're discovering about how difficult it is to actually enact some of this change because some of this is actually predestined to not actually occur in the way that we've structured union contracts with police, in the way that we have established city charters that would need to be rechartered to change the fundamental role of policing in a particular jurisdiction. All of these things are legal structures that actually prevent some of those things that we're talking about from being policies that we can quickly enact. But that doesn't mean that we take a step back and give up. Right. Certainly the history of the United States is telling us that if we continue to insist and persist, we will bring about change. If someone told you in 1952 that you would have a national law that would ban segregation in public accommodations, they would have laughed in your face. And there was the 1964 Civil Rights Act to do just that. So the things that might appear impossible today are certainly possible in the future, but we have to have a strategy, a plan, and a united voice to make those things happen.
Thank you so much. That's so well said. And that's why I want to go right into now some questions that were sent forward by some of the attendees today. And one of them is speaking right to what you're saying, Dr. Logan, about a collective action and moving the needle. So what can our university do? And how can we as members of the Ohio State community, faculty, staff, alumni, move forward with our actions to demonstrate a commitment to social and racial justice every day? Can any one of you address that question as a collective body? How can we move forward in our actions to demonstrate that commitment? Anyone can take that question on for me. We're down to our last 10 minutes. I want to get some of these Q&A questions in. What can we do as a collective? And don't hold back. We need some concrete solutions today. It's a sense of urgency here.
Well, I know one of the things is we have to stay informed, right? So, Dr. Logan's the economist, he deals with numbers, but we got to know some numbers too, right? And we have to know trends. What are our enrollment trends? Where are students coming from? Where are our students of color? where are our students of low wealth and low income coming from, right? Because we see that policies, even though they may not be explicitly mentioning race, can have these disparate impacts on communities of color, on population. So we can't just say, hey, we want to do something and then pretend to be colorblind in our actions and in the policies that we then pursue. We got to be color conscious. And so one of the things is just sort of understanding where we are and then imagining where we can go, right? So if we want to be reflective of the nation, if we want to be a leader, then part of that begins with making sure that we have a diverse student body that is secure, that gets people in, that gets students of color in, and that gets them through and out on the other side, right? Like that, and then who are those students, right? I mean, where are they coming from? I mean, that's something that we can make sure as alumni, as faculty, like, hey, how are we? What are we doing to ensure this? And what can we do to be better?
Thank you so much for bringing that point up. And you're right. You mentioned a whole alumni. We're 500,000 strong and counting at The Ohio State University. So there's a question here that says, how can alumni best help move us toward that anti-racist institution, Ohio State University, and then society? Think about our collective body of 500,000 plus and counting. How can we address this as alumni? Any thoughts, even especially for those who may have seen Dr. Logan's maps, and that person can say, well, it wasn't my city, wasn't my state. Well, we know this applies across the country. So what can alumni, Dr. Logan, what do you think about that?
I think there are several things that alumni can do. Alumni have, and I realize as an alum of my own alma mater, of course, have a lot of power, and in some ways, a very different range of power than students have, to push universities in positive directions. And alumni have an interesting ability to hold their university accountable to live up to those ideals of being diverse institutions, welcoming institutions, and inherently anti-racist institutions. And there are a couple of ways you can do this on the ground. So going back to a point that Dr. Jeffries mentioned, the university sits in the city of Columbus, and we have a vanishingly small number of students who are educated in the public schools of Columbus who attend this university. Mm-hmm. It is as if it's on a different planet in terms of its distance socially from where the students in the Columbus City schools are. There are things that we could do as an institution to roll out our welcome mat, because there are just as many talented students who would flourish at Ohio State University in the Columbus City schools as there are in the other districts that send hundreds of students to the Ohio State University every year. It is upon us as a university to move in that direction. And we will do so when alumni apply the pressure for us to do that. It is part of our land-grant mission to do that. And it's a part of our open access mission to students to do that and make ourselves available to them. We exist here to educate the students in the state of Ohio. And that means all of the students in the state of Ohio. And we have to hold ourselves to that value. And the people who can do that very strongly are our alumni when they are pressuring the president and the board of trustees and other stakeholders in the institution to fund these initiatives, to support these initiatives, and to make Ohio State the place that we profess ourselves to be.
I love that you brought up the pipeline and the city schools around Ohio State University. And this reminds me quickly of a story of a teacher telling me of a teenager in the Whiteland Park area saying, Ohio State is so far out of my reach, it may as well be in Europe. Now that speaks volumes. That particular student felt like it was so outside of reach, it may as well have been in another country. And so you're right, we need to address that, absolutely. And so one of the audience members is asking us now about our take and reality with facing racism. And they're asking the question, is this something that's idiosyncratic to the United States, or is this something in other countries? Is this something that's widespread or just the US? What do you take about the widespreadness of this?
Well, I'll just say ever so briefly. I mean, racism, specifically white supremacy, is a global phenomenon. And it's been with us for, 500, 600 years or so. And so the US isn't unique in facing the challenges of dealing with racism. But that being said, there are unique conditions, right? Because race isn't real. Race is, biologically meaningless, but it's socially meaningful. And because of that, it takes on different dimensions. So race plays out differently in Brazil, right? And racism, therefore, than it does in the United States. So while it is a global phenomenon, we are dealing with a very specific sort of iteration, a manifestation of it that is roots in slavery and how this plays out here. And so we can look abroad, but in the end, we have to really look internally to deal with the ways in which racism has manifested and expressed itself, because there is no blueprint outside. The roadmap is what we design here, because it is unique in how it has been expressed.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that point. And we're down to our last 5 minutes, and I have to do a closing here. I just want to ask one last question about the social media. One of our guests is asking about, do you think the role of the social media, Twitter and Instagram, is it positively impacting or impeding our united voice on racial justice? Nikki, you want to try that one? As one of you, do you think it's helping or hurting the whole unified voice on racial justice in just 1 minute or 2 minutes before we close out?
I have no idea. I could think of a ton of ways where it's hindering these conversations, and a ton of ways where it is helping lift up things that otherwise people would have no idea about. So that's the best that I can come up with for a 30-second response, if anyone else wants to jump in.
Dr. Logan?
I can say that I think social media has some wonderful possibilities. You can learn a lot in social media. One of the things that I do really appreciate about academic Twitter is people with extensive expertise sharing their wisdom on topics, and nearly in real time. To see virologists, for example, as this pandemic unfolded in the spring, talk about what a coronavirus was, because it wasn't something anybody knew anything about and was talking about in February, but we've certainly become very quick experts today. And they were able to share that information in a format that was very translational and actually was transformative. And the same thing as people who have knowledge of the criminal justice system, when those issues were really at the forefront in May and in June, that information being shared there is there. Now, there is a lot of trash in addition to that treasure, and it's important for people to cultivate. But I think it goes back to a fundamental move that we've made in the information age, which is that it is not a function or a problem where we don't have information. What we need to know is that the information that we have is of high quality and that it is trustworthy. And that is where I think social media can be good and used for good if we appropriately curate and cure the information that we're taking and feeding in.
Thank you. And we're going to stop on that note, because that's an excellent ending point before we go into our closing. And I want to thank each of you, Nikki Basinski, Dr. Logan, and Dr. Hassan Jeffries. Thank you all for being so candid and having this important conversation around race and racism, and hopefully an anti-racist future. So let me just give my little closing here, because I want to just reiterate why we're doing this today. It is absolutely essential that we do this today. And so as our time together ends for today, please know that we are forever together as Buckeyes. And I implore each of us to just sit, think, and act on the ways to support and foster an anti-racist future. If there's ever a time, again, the time is now for seismic changes in how we conduct our affairs, so we're not sitting here 10 years, 20 years, 50 years talking about the same thing and repeating history and continuing our history. And so as alumni of the university and as private citizens, I implore you to join me in doing something different. And so I want to also remind you to please read the special issue of the Alumni Magazine from this fall, because the speakers who you have here have given wonderful stories. I want you to follow up on and read again in terms of further expanding upon their comments today. So I want to thank each of my panelists for your continued activism. I am your ally. I'm here with you. We're going to do this together because we're all tired. But we can't get too tired and quit. The fight goes on. And so I want to encourage each of our guests today to continue the conversation with your family circles and networks, so that we all can be part of the positive changes needed within our respective communities, as mentioned so many times by all of our panelists today, as well as this university, because the time is ripe for change. So please visit ODI's website to review today's recording, the webinar, and the other recordings as well. And please read, I'm gonna say it again, please read the Alumni Magazine's Autumn 2020 special issue, because it is that particular issue that spearheaded this critical and important series that you're experiencing today. And last thing, please complete the short survey following this webinar so we're able to offer the best programming possible. Have a good evening, everyone. You take care.